So this is a recording of a bunch of random Tableau tips as you clean up your graphs and make them look better. And you may have already figured out some of these and maybe not others as you explored and tried new things. So just wanted to help out and see if we could clean these sheets up and graphs and make everything look nice and clearly communicated. So there's the part of presenting to an audience where you're presenting the graph, and there's also as you work with these things on a day-to-day basis and share them with your colleagues and make things easier for yourself and for them, as you maybe have to come back to this after vacation and forget what you did at all. So like, for example, we have our data sources, and it brings in this sheet 1 that it pulled from Excel, and it might be a lot easier to remember if you just have a simple title that'll tell you what it is, but it'll be clearer that way. So that's one way you can do it. So where the data source is, that little cylinder there is a database, in case you're unfamiliar with that world, and then you can hover over this title and double click in there and change what it says there. So that is a data source renaming. Another thing we could look at here, so page sessions. So this is one thing we've been seeing is color, and I know we've edited like a range of colors here where you right click in the legend below the calculation, and you can choose these palettes that choose the color based on the numbers, and you can either choose the smooth gradient or ombre or fade depending on how into design you are. The color here smoothly moves in this gradient, or you can click stepped color where it just goes at a time in the range until it hits a certain point. So you'll see it stay like the same yellow until it hits a certain threshold, and then it gets into this lighter green and then the darker green. So it's not a lot of colors, it's just a smaller set, in this case 5. So that's one way to do it. Another thing we've looked at is grouping items. So yeah, I want to try that differently here. So as you can see, there are 2 different groups. So the way I did that was I clicked once on the first one and then used Control, or I believe Command on the Mac, to click the second one. And then you can use this little paperclip to group or ungroup the item. So there's that paperclip again. So I'm going to group them together, and then you can click these as well to ungroup. So I'm going to ungroup them all, or group them all together and ungroup them all. So originally we had just a plain bar graph, and then if you grouped 2 together, what it does is it groups those 2 together and then just does other. So that's really helpful if you're trying to tell the story and just wanted to show the related ones and then counted everything else as not really relevant, not your focus. That's fantastic. Another thing we could do is group these 2, and so now we have 2 different sets of colors. So before we were editing the colors up here in that range when it was doing it automatically based on the numbers. Here we're really exercising our control on what we want to display in our story and choose the colors ourselves. So that way over here in the marks box in color is what's controlling this. So it chose blue and orange, which are actually pretty good colors to use often. Orange is a nice proxy for red, which usually looks too negative in a lot of reports. So you could use orange as negative, although a lot of companies' logos are orange. So that's something to be aware of. But here, so you can choose the opacity, make it a little bit more see-through. You can click Edit Colors. So we grouped it together. So they're putting both of those bars here and here. And now this is a little different in that we have color palettes. So they have these pre-built palettes. You have Seattle Gray for the rest of my year. That's what it looks like. You also have some pretty cool ones here. And the idea is you can choose from these palettes. I'm going to pick from this one and try a couple different colors. So choosing from within that for the different items and apply that. So there we go. Now I have some colors that look fairly good together and organized into groups, so we can display it that way. So back to the page sessions chart. So we did do the color here, but now looking to the left, you can see there's something a little bit different here. What we had was a part of the URL after the website for Eat, Drink, Cozy, the blog. They have these, the dates and the post name and probably .htm at the end, or a slash there. So the way we can do this to make this more presentable for humans to understand and connect with emotionally is probably not going to be a URL, and it's also going to be truncated in a lot of the things that we display it as, especially as we try to squeeze them into a dashboard and stuff like that. Even the best post, Saucy Till the Burnt End, is still kind of a long name, so you might just call it Saucy if that's enough to tell you what's going on. But the way you do that is you can click on that, right click, and edit alias. So this looks like British posts. It's probably a good short one, so you'll know what it is, as long as it's enough to communicate what you need that would explain to your viewer in the context that you have what that is. So maybe it's a little bit more than that. Maybe everyone's familiar with those posts and you've already talked about it prior in the presentation. So it really depends on what you're trying to communicate, how much you need to put there. But almost anything is better than something like this that is super technical and probably not even helpful if it's cut off at like the numbers. So yeah, looking at this again on the bounce rate, and we have our stepped color, and this one we had dropped bounce rate over as a color intensity effect over the line. And because of that, like this line, it's, thin lines are really great. I think they're usually more effective than really thicker lines, but in this case, it's kind of a little bit harder to see that subtle effect of the color, so I think I will increase the size there a little bit to that. So we can try a few different things here as well. We can try different marks. So here we can choose this mark line area here. So a lot of times we've been going with the automatic or the show me, and it would choose it ourselves. You can manually change this from a bar to a line, or an area chart or something like that, or even a circle. So now that we have these two pieces of data, and I know a lot of times we're comparing two different things, and you can use that color overlay as one option. You can have them side by side, like this, or like that in a vertical format. That can be helpful. And one option, which is a controversial option sometimes, is to have that dual axes chart. So it's not on this first area, but on that second field for new users here, you can see if you right click, there's a dual axis option. So now instead of having those two on top of each other, you have the bounce rate on the left and new users on the right. And you can still change the mark type for each one here. So that is the line there, and you can collapse that, and and then the circle here, or you could do another line and layer them on top of each other. Yeah, so that's one thing we can do. Okay. So let's try to apply a few of those different things we already did here. So we have the renamed landing pages, now just a blue graph that puts me to sleep. And so let's see, most of these are international. I'm going to group the two American ones by clicking once with my mouse and then Control or Command to get the second one. And then I'm going to go over to right click it and click paperclip group, and then it automatically chose a, what was that, mauve, some sort of purple, and then gave these colors to the international posts as well there. So I'm not really feeling the mauve or whatever that is, and I'm going to go to color, edit colors, and I'm going to select a color palette. I'm going to try this green, orange, teal one. And so instead of individually choosing that, which I could, another option here is I'm just going to assign the palette and click apply and OK. And it applied it for us right there. So another thing we can do is show the label of the data information. As I hover over this, you can see the values of the data there, but I know there is the option to put it on everything. Usually that's a lot of numbers for clutter and trying to focus on what you want the viewer to focus on. So in this case, I just want to focus on these two and really drive the point home right here. So I'm going to do the same thing, that single click there, control and clicking the second one, and then I'm going to right click, and you can do mark label, always show. So that's just going to add the number to the ones that I highlighted there. So it's kind of enough so you know, okay, yeah, I'm going to be talking about these two and the number of sessions for both of them, and then not talking about all the detail for all these at that moment. So that'd be great in story points as you talk through your story. Even if you did cover these, it's kind of good, you know, practice to keep something that's really, you know, focusable by the human mind and limited, so you can really, you know, capture people's attention on exactly what you're talking about at that moment. One thing we can also look at is the axes and how they're formatted. So Tableau does a nice clean job here of just doing a simple axes here with the, looks 20 at a time there. So we can right click, click edit axis, and here we go. So it's set to automatic, and so there are a number of options. I'm gonna drag this over to the left so we can see what happens when we change it. You may have tried the reversed axes before. In this case, this one shifts it to the right. It depends on how your graph is set up, but there you go. It almost looks like the half of a funnel chart. There you go. So you also have the option to include, here I'm going to reverse it back so we can see it. I'm going to note that, so it originally started with including 0. You don't have to. It is nice to have that as a baseline so you can see where you're coming from, but it does clean it up a bit there if you just want a cleaner chart. Right now it's set at automatic. You can choose a little bit different way of looking at it. So let's see, you have the fixed start and end at 3 to 100. So if you wanted to adjust that a little bit, you could, since you don't really need it all the way to 100, if you wanted to squeeze out a little bit more space, you could go there and see that. It's really up to your formatting and how you want to present that story. Something to think about too with axes, you always have to be careful on, you know, not being too manipulative and being, you know, focusing on the data that's there and that makes sense instead of trying to have your viewer see something that's not there. So there is sort of an ethical concern there, but just this is how you would adjust it, just for formatting and focusing on what you want to focus on. There's also little tick marks, so we have them here just automatically set to those. There's major ones, and you could set them every 10 instead of every 20, which is what is the option here. You can go back to automatic there and see what it looks like, or you could use little minor ones if you want to see the little precision of things. In this case, that's probably not too important. I'd really probably advise over simplicity over that detail level, unless you're really trying to see like the nuances of like a line chart and some sort of day-by-day change, which may have some information there for your story. But in this case, there's really such an obvious difference. Like the little tweaks don't matter much at all. But this is where you would accomplish that in the edit axes. The other thing you can do too, besides when you right click on the axis there, besides edit axis, which we just did, there's also format. So that's a little bit more practical on the design and the scale. You can choose here on numbers. So this one's pretty straightforward. It's just an integer of the numbers for the sessions. But in a lot of cases, we had currency. So there are different ways to do that, with decimals, without, with a dollar sign, or a euro sign, or who knows what. So you can choose decimal places as well. Again, in general, unless you're looking at maybe a stock, I would probably keep it simple. And then you get to choose, just like you would in Excel or anything else, how you want to represent negatives. And that depends on your audience too. Like, for communicating to my family or people like that, I'd probably not use the parenthetical as a negative, but if I was with a more financial group, that's probably fine. So just depends on who your audience is. And so the 1,000 separators, that's one to look at there. You can see how that would change a number. I would be careful with that, especially if you have an international audience, because the decimals and the commas mean very different things across the pond. So that's another thing you can adjust there. So in this case, this graph isn't a currency, but now you can see what that looks like. I know we've covered that in influencer assignments and things like that. So you may actually really want to use a currency instead of just a number. Really connects it to what you're talking about, and people will be able to understand it much more quickly if what you're talking about is money. So hopping over to a line chart, we can try a few different things. I'm going to right click here, and so on the sessions, and click select mark. So here's our mark, which is defined over here by the different things we can do with it. And I'm going to click and I can go ahead and click here on that point. I want to point out those higher points there, so I'm going to mark label always show there, and I'm going to right click on the other peak there, mark label, and always show. So that way I can talk about those two different peaks. I'm also going to try and drag month here as a filter. So drag it there and then choose months. So I could just show, I know the November data is only partial since we're still in the month, and going to click apply and shorten that down. So that's something I really want to see us do. And we can also remove quarter. I don't really need to see that in this case. If I'm looking at financial data, heck yeah, I want to look at the quarter. That's probably the only thing I want to see. But here I'm really trying to tell the story of the month, and so I filtered that down by the month. I still probably have some work to do with labels to clear that up. Instead of just saying 2018, I'll change that to say the month that I'm looking at, and that sort of thing. But focusing the data down to what you want to talk about is super key. You don't have to use every single day of all of your data. You're really wanting to focus it down. Not to like remove outliers that you can't explain necessarily, but it's just what do you want to talk about and to focus there. You're not required to use every single day or every single field or every single piece of information. Let's figure out the story we want to tell, and then figure out how to limit that data to the window of things that we want to talk about. Another thing that may make sense if you're looking at some sort of chart like this, in the analysis field there is trend lines that you could put here. So I can click that and it'll show me the trend. So you can see, even though there's a lot of volatility here, it looks like the average is slowly growing up that way, even with this lower data there. So that can be helpful, and maybe it's not. And so it's also A dotted line so you know it's not the solid data like this. And that's something also to think of when you do forecasts or predictions of the future. It's important to have that line continue on in a different way than the data you have there, just so that you're clear with the viewer what has happened and what is actual results and what is a projected future that you're basically educated guessing at. Yeah, and don't forget you can use the sorting here. So we actually have it sorted fairly well. You can do smallest to highest, smallest to lowest. That way, it's a little bit easier to understand instead of the kind of jagged look that you get when it's not that way. Yeah. So there are some features in analysis too that can show you a different way. So we have actually here is just the page sessions, although I know we have a currency here on formats, so we can change that back to a number so we don't get too confused there. So it is that number of sessions, although that number is going to be close to what I'm going to do as well. But if you go to analysis and percentage of, you can actually go to what we have. We have columns here, so sessions, that's what we're doing. So I'm going to go to analysis percentage of columns, and yeah, so the actual percentage of the total sessions, so all of these added up together. So the whiskey post was over 43.9% of total sessions. So instead of the absolute number you would have before, which we can look at here, which looks like 90, you can look at the percent of total sessions here. So percentages I think are really awesome for telling stories because it's really a lot clearer, especially to a lay audience or even experts. It's just a very fast way of understanding things. So I think that's a great option. So to review that, it's analysis, percentage of, and in this case I chose column because that's what we have up here for sessions. Depends on, if we swapped those and it was rows and we're looking at it like this, you would do analysis, percentage of, and then row, which it changed for us when we automatically made that switch. But if you were doing it from scratch, you would choose row in this case because that's where your data is right here. So a great way to tell a story through percentage instead of just focused on those raw numbers. You can get something very quickly understood by a viewer. So a few other things we could do to clean things up. So, these are all the landing pages, and you could just cover that in the title. Maybe page sessions is enough, or maybe it's just clear after the story you're telling. If these are all the landing pages, you're already talking about it or you introduced it. Another thing you can do to clear that up is maybe you don't need that, and that's kind of how you can try asking when you're looking for feedback if they viewing your graph know what these are already. I would right click on that and click hide field labels for columns in this case, and now it's gone. So now you can focus on a few less things and your brain has less cognitive overload as you can just kind of process oh, okay, here are the page sessions, these are pages, they're the percent of total sessions. Yeah, and that's another thing to think about too. So these are pages. It said landing page there. They are web pages, so something to think about is synonyms and what is the natural way of talking about the data with your audience that makes sense to you, that you're comfortable with, that you think communicates it. You are not stuck with the name of whatever you're given in the data or in the title of the worksheet or in the title of the data source. You can call it whatever you want. Does page sessions really communicate the emotional impact you want to have it there, or is it web page views, which isn't exactly the same thing as a session, but it depends on the audience. How precise do you want to be in the description of it, and what words do you want to use? And that's kind of your selection process on the language that you think will effectively get across your message that you want to tell your story with. And there's really an infinite number of formatting options here, and I don't really want to go into a lot of them, and I'd kind of discourage you from a lot of the Drop shadows, borders can be helpful, especially if you're on top of some sort of other background, like a faded photograph or something that you're trying to give a little bit more interesting imagery to. Like if you were to have a marketing page or some sort of campaign, maybe this is too boring and you want to really spice it up. I'd be very cautious and minimalistic with a lot of the things you do, but there are a lot of options here with that. So you can explore right-clicking and changing format and adding. They have background images here you can add, in that way. I would look at a few other things though. So these are all vertical, which actually research shows vertical reading is not the best as well. Although the spacing works really well for this particular graph on the vertical, since you have a little bit longer titles. But one thing you can do is change that. So I'm going to highlight this particular label and you can click rotate label. So that one, as I said before, probably needs to be shortened down to saucy and probably spelled correctly, but the other ones like British, Japan, French look a lot better in the horizontal orientation and probably faster for your viewer to read. So that's about it for now on these tips. We might do another one of these in the future, but this is a lot to get started with and to make the changes you want to change to communicate your data story.